Between 1923 and 1947, the Ashbriar Rehabilitation Institute in the Colorado Rockies processed over 2,000 patients, yet only 847 were ever officially discharged. Hidden among the pine-covered peaks 40 miles west of Denver, the Ashbriar Rehabilitation Institute stood as a monument to progressive mental health care. Its pristine white buildings and manicured gardens belied the screams that echoed through its basement corridors at night. For 24 years, families across the American West entrusted their most vulnerable members to Dr. Edmund Ashbriar's revolutionary treatment methods. What they didn't know was that their loved ones were disappearing into a network of unmarked graves scattered throughout the Rocky Mountain wilderness, victims of experiments that would make the Nazi physicians seem restrained by comparison. The institution's reputation. The Ashbriar Rehabilitation Institute opened its doors on September 15, 1923, welcomed into the Colorado medical community with unprecedented fanfare. Dr. Edmund Ashbriar, a Harvard-trained neurologist with degrees from Johns Hopkins and the University of Vienna, had spent 3 years designing what he called the future of mental health treatment in America. The facility, constructed at a cost of $2, $3 million, equivalent to over $35 million today, sprawled across 640 acres of pristine Rocky Mountain terrain, its architecture inspired by the grand sanatoriums of Switzerland. The main building, a 4-story structure of white limestone and steel, housed administrative offices, patient quarters, and what Dr. Ashbriar termed therapeutic workshops. 2 smaller buildings contained the dining facilities and recreational areas, while a 4th structure, partially underground and connected to the main building by a series of tunnels, housed the medical wing. The entire complex was surrounded by 12-foot walls disguised as decorative stonework, ostensibly to prevent patients from wandering into the dangerous mountain wilderness. Dr. Ashbriar's reputation preceded him. Born in 1881 to a wealthy Boston family, he had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School in 1905, then spent 5 years studying under the renowned Dr. Emil Kraepelin in Munich. His early research on the neurological basis of mental illness had earned him recognition from the American Psychiatric Association, and his 1919 paper, Cellular Regeneration in the Treatment of Dementia Praecox, had been hailed as groundbreaking work that could revolutionize the treatment of schizophrenia. The Institute's patient roster read like a who's who of American society's troubled elite. Families from as far away as Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York sent their mentally ill relatives to Colorado, drawn by Dr. Ashbriar's promises of discreet, humane treatment that would restore their loved ones to productive lives. The facility's brochures, printed on expensive paper with gold lettering, described revolutionary therapies including neurological recalibration, cellular rejuvenation treatments, and advanced surgical interventions that were supposedly decades ahead of conventional psychiatric care. Among the Institute's early patients were Margaret Fairfax, daughter of a prominent Chicago industrialist who had been diagnosed with manic depression following a nervous breakdown in 1924. Her family paid $10,000 annually for her care, a sum that would exceed $150,000 in today's money. There was also Robert Cornelius Walsh, son of a New York banking family, who had been exhibiting what his family described as violent episodes and inappropriate behavior since returning from the Great War. The Walsh family's donations to the Institute exceeded $50,000 during Robert's residency. Dr. Ashbriar's staff consisted of carefully selected professionals who shared his vision of advancing psychiatric medicine through bold experimentation. Dr. Helen Morrison, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, served as the Institute's chief of psychiatric medicine. She had previously worked at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, where she had gained experience in what she called aggressive intervention techniques for treating violent patients. Dr. William Franklin, the Institute's chief of surgical services, had trained under Dr. Antonio Moniz in Portugal, studying the emerging field of lobotomy procedures. The Institute's treatment philosophy was revolutionary for its time. Dr. Ashbriar believed that mental illness stemmed from specific neurological defects that could be corrected through targeted intervention. His approach combined pharmaceutical treatments, often experimental drugs obtained through his connections with European researchers, with surgical procedures designed to reset damaged neural pathways. He was particularly interested in the potential of hormonal treatments, believing that carefully controlled doses of various glandular extracts could restore normal brain function. Local authorities in the small mountain communities surrounding the institute viewed the facility with a mixture of pride and caution. The institute employed over 150 local residents, from groundskeepers to kitchen staff, providing crucial jobs in an economically depressed region. Sheriff Thomas Lambert of Clear Creek County regularly praised Dr. Ashbriar's work in public statements, noting that the institute had never had a single security incident or patient escape. The Colorado State Medical Board conducted its required annual inspections without incident, consistently rating the facility as exceptional. The institute's public relations efforts were sophisticated and effective. Dr. Ashbriar regularly published articles in medical journals describing successful treatments and breakthrough therapies. He was a frequent speaker at psychiatric conferences where his presentations on innovative approaches to treatment-resistant mental illness drew standing ovations from colleagues. The Institute's annual report, distributed to families and medical professionals, featured testimonials from grateful families whose loved ones had been restored to normal life through Dr. Ashbriar's methods. Media coverage of the Institute was universally positive. The Denver Post published a glowing feature story in 1926, describing the facility as a beacon of hope for families struggling with mental illness. The article, written by Society reporter Alice Norton, described the Institute's beautiful grounds, dedicated staff and revolutionary treatment methods. Norton interviewed several families who praised Dr. Ashbriar's compassionate approach and the dramatic improvements they had witnessed in their relatives. The Institute's reputation was further enhanced by its research publications. Dr. Ashbriar and his staff published over 40 papers in medical journals between 1923 and 1935, documenting their treatment methods and reporting remarkable success rates. Their 1928 study, Neurological Intervention in Chronic Schizophrenia, a 5-year analysis, claimed a 73% success rate in treating patients who had been deemed incurable by conventional methods. The paper was cited in medical textbooks and influenced psychiatric treatment protocols at facilities across the country. Financial records from the period show that the Institute was extraordinarily profitable. Annual revenues exceeded $800,000 by 1930, with operating expenses of less than $300,000. The substantial profits were reinvested into what Dr. Ashbriar called advanced research initiatives, though the specific nature of these programs was never publicly disclosed. The Institute maintained extensive financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies, medical equipment manufacturers, and research institutions, generating additional revenue. Through consulting contracts and equipment testing agreements, the facility's patient population grew steadily throughout the 1920s and 1930s. By 1935, the Institute housed over 400 patients, with a waiting list of more than 200 families seeking admission. The patient demographic was remarkably consistent, wealthy families seeking discreet treatment for relatives whose mental illness threatened family reputation or financial interests. The Institute's admission criteria were stringent, requiring not only substantial financial resources, but also signed agreements that gave Dr. Ashbriar complete authority over treatment decisions. The Institute's success attracted international attention. Delegations of physicians from England, Germany, and France visited the facility to observe Dr. Ashbriar's methods firsthand. In 1934, the International Congress of Psychiatry awarded Dr. Ashbriar the prestigious Kraepelin Medal for his contributions to the field of psychiatric medicine. The award ceremony, held in Vienna, was attended by over 500 of the world's leading psychiatrists and neurologists. By the late 1930s, the Ashbriar Rehabilitation Institute had established itself as the premier psychiatric facility in the American West. Its reputation for innovative treatment, combined with its discreet handling of wealthy families' most sensitive problems, had created a waiting list that extended for years. The Institute's success had made Dr. Ashbriar a wealthy man, with personal assets exceeding $2 million and extensive real estate holdings throughout Colorado. The facility had become a symbol of American medical innovation, proof that mental illness could be conquered through scientific rigor and financial resources. What the public didn't know was that the Institute's remarkable success rates were built on a foundation of carefully manipulated statistics, falsified patient records, and a systematic program of eliminating evidence of treatment failures. The 1,053 patients who had simply vanished from the Institute's records weren't medical miracles. They were victims of a program of medical experimentation that would undetected for another decade. Ignored signs. The first documented concern about the Ashbriar Rehabilitation Institute appeared in a letter dated March 15, 1927, written by Mrs. Catherine Burke of Kansas City, Missouri. Her son, Harold Burke, had been admitted to the facility 6 months earlier for treatment of what his family described as nervous exhaustion and melancholia following his discharge from the Army. Mrs. Burke's letter, addressed to the Colorado State Medical Board, expressed alarm that her son had not been permitted to write letters or receive visitors for over 4 months. Dr. Ashbriar assures me that Harold is making excellent progress, Mrs. Burke wrote, but I find it most peculiar that a young man who wrote to me weekly throughout his military service should suddenly become unable to correspond with his family. When I attempted to visit last month, I was told that Harold was undergoing intensive treatment that required complete isolation from outside influences. I request that your board investigate these policies, as they seem unnecessarily cruel and contrary to established medical practice. The State Medical Board's response, filed 3 weeks later, was dismissive. Board Secretary Dr. Charles Baker noted that the Institute's treatment protocols had been reviewed and approved, and that Dr. Ashbriar's methods, while unconventional, were considered experimental treatments within accepted medical standards. The board declined to investigate further, stating that interference with ongoing treatment could jeopardize patient recovery. Similar complaints accumulated throughout 1927 and 1928. The State Medical Board's files, discovered decades later in a basement storage room, contained over 60 letters from families expressing concern about communication restrictions, unexplained treatment delays, and what several correspondents described as substantial changes in personality when they were eventually allowed to visit their relatives. The board's responses followed a consistent pattern: polite acknowledgement, references to Dr. Ashbriar's reputation and expertise, and declining to investigate. Local residents began reporting unusual activities at the Institute as early as 1928. Frank Reynolds, who operated a small general store in the nearby town of Georgetown, told friends that Institute staff had begun purchasing unusual quantities of lime, kerosene, and industrial chemicals. They used to come in for normal supplies, Reynolds later told investigators. Food, cleaning supplies, medical items. But starting around 1928, they were buying things that didn't make sense for a hospital. Barrels of lime, cases of kerosene, chemicals I'd never heard of. When I asked what they needed all that lime for, they said it was for groundskeeping projects. More disturbing reports came from local contractors and delivery drivers. Eugene Hoffman, who drove supply trucks for a Denver medical equipment company, reported that Institute staff had requested deliveries be made exclusively during nighttime hours between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. They said it was to avoid disrupting patient schedules, Hoffman recalled, but it struck me as strange. I'd been delivering to hospitals for 15 years, and I'd never heard of such a requirement. And some of the equipment they were ordering, surgical instruments, restraining devices, things that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. The Institute's isolation policies became increasingly strict as the 1920s progressed. By 1929, patient visits were limited to 1 per month, and all visits were supervised by Institute staff. Correspondence was heavily censored, with many letters arriving at family homes with entire paragraphs blacked out. Several families reported that their relatives' handwriting appeared different, and that the content of letters seemed stilted and unnatural. Dr. Raymond Elliott, a Denver psychiatrist who had trained with Dr. Ashbriar at Harvard, began expressing private concerns about his former colleague's methods as early as 1929. In a letter to Dr. Albert Fisher, chief of psychiatry at Denver General Hospital, Elliott wrote, "I have spoken with several families whose relatives have been treated at Ashbriar's facility, and I am troubled by what I hear. The isolation policies are extreme, even by the standards of institutional care. More concerning are the reports of dramatic personality changes in patients who have been discharged. 3 separate families have described their relatives as appearing vacant or different following treatment, exhibiting behaviors and speech patterns that seem artificial or coached." Elliott's concerns were shared by other members of the Colorado medical community, but professional courtesy and Dr. Ashbriar's reputation prevented open criticism. The Institute's success stories were well publicized, while families who had concerns were often reluctant to speak publicly about their relatives' mental health treatment. The stigma surrounding mental illness in the 1920s and 1930s meant that many families preferred to suffer in silence rather than risk additional embarrassment. The first documented attempt to investigate the Institute came in 1931, when Colorado State Senator Walter Green announced his intention to visit the facility as part of a legislative review of state-funded mental health programs. Although the Institute was privately operated, it received substantial tax benefits and had contracts with several state agencies. Senator Green's visit was scheduled for November 15, 1931, but was cancelled at the last minute when he was involved in a severe automobile accident on the morning of his planned visit. The circumstances of Senator Green's accident were unusual. His car had apparently struck a tree on a straight section of highway in broad daylight, despite clear weather conditions. Green, an experienced driver with no history of accidents, was found unconscious at the scene with severe head injuries. He remained in a coma for 6 weeks and upon recovery claimed to have no memory of the accident or his planned investigation of the Institute. He never rescheduled his visit, and his office issued a statement declaring that the legislative review had been postponed indefinitely. Local law enforcement officials began receiving disturbing reports about the Institute in the early 1930s. Clear Creek County Sheriff Thomas Lambert documented several incidents in his official reports, though he took no investigative action. In January 1932, hunters discovered human remains in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains, approximately 8 miles from the Institute. The remains were badly decomposed and partially scattered by wildlife, making identification impossible. Sheriff Lambert's report noted that the remains appeared to be those of a young adult, but concluded that they likely belonged to a hiker or mountain climber who had died in an accident. Similar discoveries were made in 1933 and 1934. In each case, Sheriff Lambert's reports dismissed the findings as accidental deaths or natural causes. The sheriff's reluctance to investigate was likely influenced by the Institute's economic importance to the region and Dr. Ashbriar's political connections. The Institute was one of the county's largest employers, and Dr. Ashbriar had contributed substantial sums to local political campaigns and charitable organizations. The most significant early warning came from Dr. Marie Douglas, a young psychiatrist who worked at the Institute for 6 months in 1933. Dr. Douglas, a recent graduate of the University of Chicago Medical School, had been hired as an assistant to Dr. Morrison in the psychiatric ward. Her employment was terminated abruptly in September 1933, officially for philosophical differences regarding treatment protocols. Dr. Douglas's departure was followed by a series of letters to medical colleagues describing disturbing practices at the Institute. In a letter to her former professor, Dr. Lawrence Harper, at the University of Chicago, she wrote, "I can no longer remain silent about what I witnessed during my time at the Ashbriar Institute. The treatment methods being employed there are not only unethical, but constitute systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. I have documented evidence of unauthorized surgical procedures, experimental drug trials conducted without patient consent, and what can only be described as torture disguised as medical treatment. Dr. Douglas's allegations were detailed and specific. She claimed that Dr. Ashbriar was conducting unauthorized lobotomy procedures on patients without family consent, using experimental drugs obtained through connections with European researchers, and maintaining a secret ward in the basement where patients were subjected to what she described as behavioral modification experiments. She also alleged that patient deaths were being systematically concealed, with bodies disposed of in remote mountain locations. The medical community's response to Dr. Douglas's allegations was swift and decisive. She was dismissed as a disgruntled employee making false accusations to damage Dr. Ashbriar's reputation. The American Psychiatric Association conducted a cursory investigation, interviewing Dr. Ashbriar and several staff members who denied all allegations. Dr. Douglas's attempts to interest medical journals in her story were unsuccessful, and her career effectively ended when she was blacklisted from academic positions. The Institute's response to Dr. Douglas's allegations was sophisticated and effective. Dr. Ashbriar issued a public statement expressing sadness that a promising young physician had become consumed by jealousy and professional inadequacy. He released selected portions of Dr. Douglas's employment records, suggesting that she had been terminated for incompetence and inability to work effectively with patients. Several of Dr. Douglas's former colleagues at the Institute provided statements questioning her stability and professional judgment. By 1935, the pattern of ignored warnings had become entrenched. Families who expressed concerns were told that their relatives' treatment required complete trust in Dr. Ashbriar's methods. Local authorities dismissed unusual incidents as coincidences or natural occurrences. The medical community, intimidated by Dr. Ashbriar's reputation and political connections, refused to investigate allegations that could damage the profession's credibility. The Institute's isolation policies became even more restrictive. By 1936, patient visits were limited to 1 per quarter, and all communication was subject to strict censorship. Families were told that outside influences could interfere with breakthrough treatments that were on the verge of curing their relatives' mental illness. The promise of imminent recovery kept families compliant, even as years passed without meaningful progress. The final ignored warning came in 1937, when Dr. Ernest Chapman, a federal investigator with the Public Health Service, attempted to conduct an unannounced inspection of the Institute. Dr. Chapman had been assigned to investigate reports of unusual patient mortality rates at psychiatric facilities in the western states. His visit to the Institute was brief and unproductive. He was told that most patient records were confidential and could not be reviewed without court orders, and that the facility's medical director was unavailable for interviews. Dr. Chapman's report, filed with the Public Health Service in Washington, noted several concerning factors about the Institute, including the unusual secrecy surrounding patient records, the reluctance of staff to discuss treatment methods, and the facility's isolation from medical oversight. However, his recommendations for further investigation were shelved when the Public Health Service received a letter from Senator Roy Fletcher of Colorado, praising the Institute's work and questioning the need for federal interference with state-regulated medical facilities. The pattern of ignored signs continued throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. Each warning was dismissed, each concern was explained away, and each attempt at investigation was blocked by institutional resistance and political influence. The families who had entrusted their loved ones to Dr. Ashbriar's care remained hopeful that revolutionary treatments would eventually restore their relatives to normal life, unaware that many of those relatives had been dead for years. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the Ashbriar Institute's facade appeared on the morning of October 23, 1943, when a flash flood in Clear Creek Canyon exposed a mass grave containing the remains of at least 47 individuals. The flooding, caused by an unusually heavy autumn storm, had washed away topsoil and vegetation from a remote area approximately 6 miles from the institute, revealing what appeared to be systematic burial sites. Marked with numbered metal tags, Sheriff Thomas Lambert, who had spent 15 years dismissing concerns about the institute, could no longer ignore the evidence scattered across the muddy canyon floor. The remains showed signs of surgical intervention, with several skulls exhibiting holes consistent with lobotomy procedures. More disturbing were the metal tags, which bore patient numbers that corresponded to the Institute's record-keeping system. The sheriff's initial response was to contact Dr. Ashbriar directly, hoping to find a reasonable explanation for the grisly discovery. Dr. Ashbriar's response was characteristically calm and authoritative. He explained that the remains were those of patients who had died of natural causes and had been buried in accordance with Colorado health regulations when their families could not be located or could not afford burial expenses. The metal tags, he claimed, were required for record-keeping purposes. This explanation might have been accepted, except for the testimony of Samuel Warren, a former groundskeeper at the Institute who had been dismissed in 1942 for what personnel records described as drinking on the job. Warren, who had been struggling with alcoholism since his termination, approached Sheriff Lambert 3 days after the flood discovery. What he told the sheriff would begin the unraveling of Dr. Ashbriar's carefully constructed deception. "I helped dig those graves," Warren told Sheriff Lambert in a statement recorded on October 26, 1943, "not just the ones they found in the canyon, but dozens of others scattered throughout the mountains." Dr. Ashbriar called it environmental disposal, said it was more hygienic than traditional burial. But these weren't people who died of natural causes. Some of them were still alive when I helped carry them out to the burial sites. Warren's testimony was detailed and horrifying. He described a systematic program of disposing of patients who had died during experimental procedures, as well as patients who had been intentionally killed when their conditions made them unsuitable for continued experimentation. He claimed that Dr. Ashbriar maintained detailed records of these activities, including photographs and surgical notes, in a locked filing system in the basement medical wing. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Warren's employment at the Institute had been terminated not for drinking but because he had witnessed a disposal operation and had questioned the supervisors involved. His alcoholism had developed after his termination, as he struggled to cope with what he had seen at the Institute. Warren's testimony was corroborated by his wife, Norma Warren, who confirmed that her husband had exhibited severe anxiety and nightmares following his work at the Institute. Armed with Warren's testimony, Sheriff Lambert obtained a warrant to search the Institute's medical records. The search, conducted on November 8, 1943, revealed a complex system of dual record-keeping that concealed the true nature of the Institute's operations. The official patient records, maintained for family correspondence and regulatory inspections, showed hundreds of successful treatments and discharges, but the secret records kept in Dr. Ashbriar's private files told a different story. The secret records documented a systematic program of medical experimentation that had been conducted on unwilling patients for over 15 years. Dr. Ashbriar's notes, written in a clinical, dispassionate style, described procedures that ranged from unauthorized lobotomies to experimental drug trials to surgical interventions designed to test theories about the neurological basis of mental illness. The record showed that patient consent was never obtained and that families were deliberately deceived about the nature of their relatives' treatment. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a series of photographs documenting surgical procedures performed on conscious patients. Dr. Ashbriar's notes indicated that anesthesia was often omitted from procedures to allow for real-time observation of neurological responses. The photographs showed patients in obvious distress, restrained on operating tables, while surgical instruments were applied to their exposed brains. The clinical notes accompanying these images discussed the patient's verbal responses to different types of neural stimulation. The scope of the experimental program was staggering. Dr. Ashbriar's records documented over 300 unauthorized surgical procedures, including experimental lobotomies, brain tissue removal, and what he called neural pathway modification. More than 150 patients had been subjected to experimental drug trials, including tests of compounds that had never been approved for human use. The mortality rate for these procedures was approximately 60%, with most deaths occurring within days of the experimental treatment. The investigation revealed that Dr. Ashbriar had been conducting these experiments with the full knowledge and participation of his senior staff. Dr. Helen Morrison, the chief of psychiatric medicine, had developed what she called behavioral modification protocols that involved systematic psychological torture designed to break down patients' personalities. Her notes described techniques including sensory deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and deliberate infliction of pain to reconstruct personality structures. Dr. William Franklin, the chief of surgical services, had been responsible for the physical disposal of patients who died during experimentation. His records showed that bodies were typically transported to remote mountain locations during nighttime hours, buried in unmarked graves, and the burial sites were carefully mapped to avoid accidental discovery. Franklin's notes indicated that he had disposed of at least 200 bodies between 1925 and 1943. The Institute's financial records revealed the economic motivation behind the experimental program. Dr. Ashbriar had been receiving substantial payments from pharmaceutical companies for testing experimental drugs, from medical equipment manufacturers for testing surgical instruments, and from European researchers for sharing data about his experimental procedures. The Institute's annual revenue from these research contracts exceeded $400,000, representing more than half of the facility's total income. The investigation also uncovered evidence of systematic deception of patients' families. The Institute maintained a staff of individuals whose sole responsibility was to forge letters from patients to their families, creating the illusion that patients were alive and improving when they had actually died. Months or years earlier, these forged letters were carefully crafted to match patients' handwriting and communication styles and were sent on a regular schedule to maintain the deception. The most damning evidence came from Dr. Ashbriar's personal journal, discovered in a safe in his office. The journal, written in Dr. Ashbriar's own handwriting, revealed the full scope of his motivations and methods. The advancement of medical science, he wrote in a 1931 entry, requires the sacrifice of inferior specimens of humanity. The mentally ill serve no useful purpose to society, and their sacrifice in the cause of scientific progress is not only justified, but morally required. The families who entrust these defective individuals to our care are paying for the privilege of contributing to humanity's advancement. The journal entries revealed Dr. Ashbriar's growing megalomania and his belief that he was conducting work that would revolutionize human understanding of the brain and mental illness. He wrote extensively about his theories of genetic cleansing and neurological purification, describing his experiments as the first step toward eliminating mental illness from the human population. His notes showed that he viewed his patients not as human beings, but as experimental subjects whose suffering was irrelevant to the greater good of scientific advancement. The investigation revealed that the Institute had processed over 2,000 patients during its 20-year operation, but only 847 had been officially discharged. Of those discharged, investigators found that many had been subjected to experimental procedures that had left them severely brain damaged or psychologically destroyed. The success stories that had built the Institute's reputation were actually patients whose personalities had been so thoroughly destroyed by experimental procedures that they were incapable of describing their experiences. The discovery of the mass grave and the subsequent investigation created a media sensation that destroyed the Institute's reputation overnight. Families who had believed their relatives were receiving the finest medical care available learned that they had been paying for their loved ones to be tortured and murdered. The psychological devastation to these families was profound, with several relatives committing suicide upon learning the truth about their family members' fate. The investigation revealed that the Institute's crimes extended beyond the patients themselves. Several staff members who had attempted to report the experimental program had been subjected to the same procedures as patients, effectively silencing potential whistleblowers through torture and murder. Dr. Marie Douglas, the young psychiatrist who had attempted to expose the institute in 1933, was found to have been readmitted to the institute as a patient in 1934, where she had died during an experimental procedure. The evidence collected during the investigation filled over 200 boxes and included thousands of photographs, detailed surgical notes, financial records, and correspondence with collaborators at other institutions. The scope of the documentation suggested that Dr. Ashbriar had been meticulous in recording his crimes, possibly planning to use the data to establish his legacy as a pioneer in psychiatric research. The investigation also revealed that the Institute's crimes had been facilitated by a network of corrupt officials and complicit professionals. Local politicians had accepted substantial bribes to prevent investigation of the Institute, while medical professionals had participated in cover-ups to protect the reputation of their profession. The institutional corruption extended to the state level, with evidence suggesting that Colorado health officials had been aware of the Institute's activities, but had chosen to ignore them. The horror uncovered at the Ashbriar Institute represented one of the most systematic and extensive programs of medical experimentation and murder in American history. The evidence revealed a level of cruelty and dehumanization that shocked even experienced investigators. The discovery that such crimes had been committed under the guise of medical treatment by respected professionals at a prestigious institution fundamentally challenged public trust in the medical establishment. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged of the Institute's crimes. Additional burial sites were discovered throughout the Rocky Mountains, containing hundreds more victims of Dr. Ashbriar's experimental program. The full scope of the Institute's crimes would never be completely known, as Dr. Ashbriar and his senior staff had destroyed much of the evidence before the investigation began. Legacy and silence. The arrest of Dr. Edmund Ashbriar on December 15, 1943, marked the beginning of what should have been the most significant medical war crimes prosecution in American history. Instead, it became a masterclass in institutional cover-up and the systematic suppression of evidence that would ensure the Ashbriar Institute's crimes remained largely hidden from public view. The initial charges against Dr. Ashbriar and his senior staff were comprehensive and damning. The Colorado Attorney General's office, led by prosecutor Harold Price, filed murder charges for 127 confirmed deaths, assault charges for over 200 documented cases of unauthorized surgical procedures, and fraud charges related to the systematic deception of patients' families. The evidence contained in those 200 boxes of documentation seemed to guarantee convictions that would result in multiple death sentences. However, the prosecution faced immediate and overwhelming opposition from sources that should have been supporting the pursuit of justice. The American Medical Association, rather than condemning Dr. Ashbriar's crimes, instead focused on the damage to medical profession's reputation that would result from extensive publicity about the case. In a confidential memo dated January 18, 1944, AMA President Dr. George Mitchell wrote, "The Ashbriar matter represents a significant threat to public confidence in psychiatric medicine. We must ensure that this case is resolved with minimal publicity and maximum protection for the medical profession's credibility." The AMA's strategy was implemented through a coordinated campaign that combined legal maneuvering, political pressure, and media manipulation. The organization's legal team, led by prominent attorney Arthur Newman, filed numerous motions challenging the admissibility of evidence, claiming that the search of the Institute had violated Dr. Ashbriar's constitutional rights. These legal challenges delayed the trial for over 18 months, allowing time for other forces to work behind the scenes. The federal government's involvement in the case was complicated by the revelation that several government agencies had been aware of the Institute's activities and had chosen not to intervene. The Public Health Service had received Dr. Chapman's report in 1937, but had taken no action. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring the institute since 1940 as part of a broader investigation into medical facilities with foreign connections, but had not pursued evidence of criminal activity. More significantly, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, had been in contact with Dr. Ashbriar since 1942, seeking to recruit him for intelligence work related to interrogation techniques and psychological warfare. The OSS had been interested in Dr. Ashbriar's research into personality modification and behavioral control, viewing his work as potentially valuable for military applications. This connection created national security implications that would ultimately be used to justify suppressing evidence about the Institute's crimes. The first major blow to the prosecution came in March 1945, when federal judge Carl Bennett ruled that much of the evidence obtained during the search of the Institute was inadmissible due to what he termed procedural irregularities in the warrant application. Judge Bennett's ruling excluded Dr. Ashbriar's personal journal, the secret patient records, and the photographic documentation of surgical procedures. The ruling effectively gutted the prosecution's case, leaving them with only the testimony of former employees and the physical evidence from the mass grave. The timing of Judge Bennett's ruling was suspicious, coming just weeks after he had received a substantial campaign contribution from the Colorado Medical Society for his upcoming re-election campaign. The contribution, totaling $25,000, was the largest political donation in the Society's history. Judge Bennett's ruling was widely criticized by legal experts, but appeals to higher courts were unsuccessful. The second major setback came with the systematic intimidation and elimination of key witnesses. Samuel Warren, the former groundskeeper whose testimony had initiated the investigation, was found dead in his home on April 3, 1945, from what the coroner ruled was a drug overdose. Warren's wife, Norma, disappeared 3 days later and was never found. The official investigation concluded that Warren had committed suicide due to guilt over his role in the Institute's crimes, and that his wife had left town to escape the publicity. Other witnesses faced similar fates. Dr. Raymond Elliott, the Denver psychiatrist who had raised early concerns about the Institute, was killed in a car accident in June 1945. Eugene Hoffman, the truck driver who had reported unusual equipment deliveries, was found dead in his truck from apparent carbon monoxide poisoning in September 1945. Frank Reynolds, the store owner who had questioned the Institute's purchases of lime and chemicals, died in a house fire in October 1945. The systematic elimination of witnesses was too obvious to ignore, but law enforcement agencies showed no interest in investigating the connections between these deaths and the Ashbriar case. Sheriff Lambert, who had initially pursued the investigation, was transferred to an administrative position in the state capitol, effectively removing him from the case. His replacement, Sheriff Donald Freeman, announced that his department would not pursue any further investigations related to the Institute. The media coverage of the case was carefully managed through a combination of legal restrictions and economic pressure. Major newspapers were discouraged from extensive coverage through threats of libel suits and withdrawal of advertising revenue from medical organizations. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the case faced harassment and intimidation that ended their careers. Alice Norton, the Denver Post reporter who had written the glowing 1926 feature about the Institute, was found dead in her apartment in November 1945, apparently from suicide, just days before she was scheduled to testify in the trial. The prosecution's case was further weakened by the revelation that several key pieces of evidence had been destroyed or lost while in police custody. The Institute's financial records, which had documented payments from pharmaceutical companies and government agencies, were destroyed in a fire at the evidence storage facility in December 1945. The fire was ruled accidental, though it occurred just hours after federal agents had requested access to the financial records. Dr. Ashbriar's trial finally began on February 15, 1946, nearly 2.5 years after his arrest. The prosecution, led by Harold Price, had been reduced to presenting a case based primarily on the physical evidence from the mass grave, and the testimony of a few remaining witnesses who had survived the systematic elimination campaign. The trial itself was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create the appearance of justice while ensuring that the full scope of the Institute's crimes would never be revealed. Dr. Ashbriar's defense team, led by prominent attorney Clarence West, employed a strategy that focused on discrediting the remaining evidence and portraying their client as a dedicated physician whose innovative methods had been misunderstood by investigators. The defense argued that the mass grave contained the remains of patients who had died of natural causes, and that the burial methods used were consistent with standard practices for handling indigent patients whose families could not afford proper burial. They claimed that the numbered tags found with the remains were simply administrative tools used to maintain records, not evidence of systematic murder. More effectively, the defense argued that much of the evidence against Dr. Ashbriar had been obtained through illegal searches and should be excluded from consideration. They successfully convinced the court that the secret records and photographic evidence had been planted by investigators seeking to fabricate a case against a respected physician. Judge Bennett's earlier ruling excluding key evidence provided the foundation for this strategy. The prosecution's case was further undermined by the testimony of character witnesses who praised Dr. Ashbriar's contributions to medical science. Dr. Joseph Carter, president of the Colorado Medical Society, testified that Dr. Ashbriar was a pioneer in psychiatric medicine whose innovative methods had saved countless lives. Dr. Carter's testimony was particularly effective because he had never worked at the Institute and was perceived as an objective expert witness. Several former patients were called to testify on Dr. Ashbriar's behalf, describing their treatment at the Institute in positive terms. These witnesses, who had been among the few patients actually discharged from the Institute, provided compelling testimony about their recovery from mental illness. What the court didn't know was that these witnesses had been subjected to experimental procedures that had fundamentally altered their personalities, making them incapable of accurately remembering or reporting their experiences. The trial revealed the existence of a broader network of corruption that extended far beyond the Institute itself. Evidence presented during the proceedings showed that Dr. Ashbriar had been collaborating with researchers at other institutions, sharing data and techniques developed through his experimental program. Universities including Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Chicago had received research reports from the Institute, though they claimed to have been unaware of the methods used to generate the data. The pharmaceutical industry's involvement in the Institute's crimes became apparent during testimony about the experimental drug trials. Representatives from major pharmaceutical companies, including Merck, Pfizer, and Abbott Laboratories, acknowledged receiving research data from the Institute but denied knowledge of how the data had been obtained. The companies claimed that they had assumed the research was being conducted according to standard ethical protocols. The federal government's involvement in the case became more complex as the trial progressed. OSS officials testified about their contact with Dr. Ashbriar, but claimed that their interest had been purely theoretical and that they had never actually recruited him for intelligence work. However, classified documents that were briefly entered into evidence before being sealed suggested that the government had been planning to relocate Dr. Ashbriar and his senior staff to a classified facility where their research could under federal oversight. The trial's outcome was predetermined by the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. On September 12, 1946, the jury found Dr. Ashbriar guilty of involuntary manslaughter in connection with 12 deaths, but acquitted him of murder charges. Dr. Helen Morrison and Dr. William Franklin were convicted of lesser charges related to improper disposal of human remains. The sentences were remarkably lenient. Dr. Ashbriar received 12 years in prison, while Morrison and Franklin received sentences of 5 years each. The sentencing hearing revealed the full scope of the cover-up. Judge Bennett acknowledged that serious irregularities had occurred at the Institute, but argued that the defendants had been misguided rather than malicious in their treatment methods. He described Dr. Ashbriar, as a brilliant physician whose dedication to advancing medical science had led him to employ methods that, while unorthodox, were motivated by a genuine desire to help his patients. The appeals process provided another opportunity for institutional protection of the medical establishment. Dr. Ashbriar's conviction was overturned by the Colorado Supreme Court in 1948 on the grounds that the prosecution had failed to prove criminal intent. The court ruled that Dr. Ashbriar's actions, while possibly negligent, had been motivated by legitimate medical purposes and could not be considered criminal under Colorado law. The institute's physical destruction was completed in the summer of 1947, when the buildings were demolished and the site was converted into a national forest recreation area. The demolition was conducted under federal supervision, with all materials being transported to an undisclosed location for disposal. The official reason given for the demolition was that the buildings posed a safety hazard, but the real purpose was to eliminate any physical evidence that might support future investigations. The fate of the remaining evidence from the investigation remains unknown. The 200 boxes of documentation were transferred to federal custody in 1948, officially for national security review. The documents were never returned to state authorities, and federal agencies have consistently denied having any records related to the Ashbriar Institute. Freedom of Information Act requests filed in later decades have been denied on national security grounds. Dr. Ashbriar himself disappeared shortly after his conviction was overturned. Official records indicate that he left Colorado in September 1948, but his subsequent whereabouts were never documented. Rumors persisted for decades that he had been relocated to a federal research facility, possibly at Los Alamos or Oak Ridge, where his expertise in behavioral modification could be utilized for classified projects. Other reports suggested that he had been exfiltrated to South America as part of Operation Paperclip, the program that relocated Nazi scientists to the United States. The families of the Institute's victims were systematically discouraged from pursuing civil litigation. Those who attempted to file wrongful death suits faced legal obstacles that made such cases virtually impossible to prosecute. The statute of limitations had expired on most potential claims, and the destruction of evidence made it difficult to prove specific instances of wrongdoing. The few families who persisted in seeking justice found their attorneys withdrew from their cases, citing conflicts of interest or lack of evidence. The silence surrounding the Ashbriar Institute became institutionalized through a combination of legal restrictions and informal pressure. Journalists who attempted to investigate the case were warned away by editors concerned about libel suits. Researchers who sought to study the Institute's records were told that the documents had been classified or destroyed. Medical professionals who had knowledge of the case were discouraged from discussing it by professional organizations concerned about damage to the field's reputation. By 1950, the Ashbriar Institute had been effectively erased from public memory. Medical textbooks that had once cited Dr. Ashbriar's research were revised to remove references to his work. Professional journals that had published his papers issued quiet retractions, claiming that the research had been based on methodological errors. The Institute's existence was acknowledged only in obscure academic papers that discussed it as an example of ethical lapses in early psychiatric medicine. The long-term impact of the Institute's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. The systematic experimentation conducted at the Institute had generated research data that influenced psychiatric treatment protocols for decades. Techniques developed through torture and murder at the Institute became standard practices at mental health facilities across the country, implemented by physicians who were unaware of their origins. The cover-up of the Ashbriar Institute's crimes established a precedent for protecting institutional interests over public accountability. The methods used to suppress evidence and silence witnesses became a template for handling similar scandals in later decades. The case demonstrated that even the most horrific crimes could be concealed if enough powerful interests were committed to maintaining secrecy. The site of the former institute remains a popular recreation area visited by thousands of hikers and campers each year. A small plaque near the parking area commemorates the location as a historic medical facility, but provides no details about the institute's activities or the crimes committed there. The mass grave discovered in 1943 was quietly relocated, and its current location is unknown. The surviving records of the Ashbriar Institute investigation are scattered among various government agencies, none of which acknowledge having complete files. State records were transferred to federal custody and subsequently disappeared. Federal agencies claim that any records they might have possessed were destroyed according to routine document retention policies. The Colorado State Medical Board's files on the institute were destroyed in a fire in 1963, which also consumed records related to dozens of other controversial cases. The families who lost relatives at the institute were left without closure or compensation. Many died without ever learning the truth about their loved one's fate. The few survivors who attempted to preserve the memory of the institute's crimes found their efforts blocked by legal restrictions and official indifference. Their stories were dismissed as conspiracy theories or exaggerations by relatives seeking attention. The medical professionals who participated in the institute's crimes faced no significant consequences for their actions. Several continued their careers at other institutions where they applied techniques developed at the institute to new generations of patients. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded the institute's research suffered no penalties and continued to profit from drugs tested on unwilling subjects. Today, more than 75 years after the discovery of the mass grave, the full scope of the Ashbriar Institute's crimes remains unknown. The systematic destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses was so effective that investigators may never determine how many people died at the facility or the full extent of the experimental program. The Institute's legacy lives on in the form of medical techniques and pharmaceutical treatments that were developed through torture and murder, their origins hidden by decades of institutional secrecy. The Ashbriar Institute represents the ultimate failure of oversight systems designed to protect vulnerable populations. The case demonstrates how respected institutions can become vehicles for systematic abuse when professional prestige, financial interests, and political influence align to prevent accountability. The cover-up that followed the Institute's exposure proved that even the most compelling evidence of institutional crimes can be suppressed when powerful interests are committed to maintaining secrecy. The silence surrounding the Ashbriar Institute serves as a reminder that institutional crimes are not aberrations, but rather predictable outcomes of systems that prioritize reputation over accountability. The techniques used to conceal the Institute's crimes, evidence destruction, witness elimination, media manipulation, and legal obstruction, have been employed repeatedly to protect powerful institutions from the consequences of their actions. The victims of the Ashbriar Institute died twice, first as subjects of medical experimentation, and again when their stories were erased from history. Their memory survives only in fragmented records and whispered stories, hidden in the shadows of institutional power that continues to protect its own interests above truth and justice.